So anytime something becomes popular in culture, a movie or series like Breaking Bad, and has so much to say about the no self philosophy and the no self path or journey, I'd like to do a video on it. So I'm going to do this video focusing on Mr. White and his journey, which is really what the series does focus on. It's not going to be an in-depth analysis. I'm just going to really focus on just what it has to say about the no-self philosophy. Now, keep in mind that I'm just going to talk about up to season 5 because that's where I'm at, and it's going to show that Walter fell short on several. Several doors were open, and he seemed it's opportunity again and again. And I always say the Grail Castle is just down the road to the left, and so we have these opportunities, but he failed on multiple accounts to take advantage of them, and ended up getting very seduced to the dark side of the ego. But before we do that, let's get into a real quick summary of the second lecture of the Buddha, which is his lecture on no self. Not intellectually demanding, actually pretty simple intellectually. The difficult part is to feel it and live it. And really just came down to 2 simple points. The first point is that there's nothing solid, stable, or continuous about the self. It feels like it. As I sit here, I absolutely have this feeling that the self that is sitting here was the same self that was in 3rd grade, the same self that went to college, the same self that was watching Breaking Bad yesterday, and the same self that will continue after this video is done. And the Buddha pointed out that that's absolutely an illusion. The self is continuous and changing and flowing, and there's nothing solid or stable to it. And so it's much more like a verb than it is a noun. So that breaks the first part of the illusion. The second part is with control. So it really feels like there's a CEO up in the skull calling the shots and making decisions. And that just isn't the case. In fact, you can prove this to yourself, particularly when it pertains to the internal world of the psyche. So if you're trying to sleep and you need to get up early the next day and you have all these intrusive thoughts about worry, about maybe there's a meeting or something, and you just want to shut it off. Well, that CEO should be able to say, you're gone, you're fired, and just shut it all down. But in fact, the CEO has no power to do any of that. In fact, the more the CEO tries to shut these thoughts down, ironically, the stronger the thoughts seem to get. So you can show for yourself that this idea of some kind of CEO who's controlling it all just isn't the case. And often what happens when the ego recognizes its failure to control the inner world, it has a poor substitute, but not from its viewpoint, but it often tries to manipulate and control the external world, others, and the objects around it. And we see that absolutely with Walter's case. And so the story of Breaking Bad, at least to me, and of course I have some biases going into it, but it seems to be a cautionary tale of the no-self path. Because when we look at Walter, he gets part of it. He gets the first insight, but he fails to get it for himself. He gets it for those around him. And then he ends up using that as a way of strengthening the ego and using this insight to control others. And so we see it as really a flaw of walking a path that gets more dangerous the closer you get to the top of the mountain. I mean, it really is a great image that seems to fit very well. If you're going up a mountain and you're a couple feet up and you fall, you're probably okay. But if you get 100 feet or you get really close to the point, the summit, and then you fall, then you're talking about some pretty serious damage. And that really is a great metaphor for the no-self path. And we see exactly how that worked out with Walter. So he has this insight, so he gets some of it. And he's at such an interesting place in his life where he's had his confrontation with death. And he even says how, when he first got his cancer diagnosis, it was like, why me? And then he gets his health diagnosis, and again, he has that same why me. So he fails to experience, dying before dying. And that's such a critical part of that insight, that the self is illusory. Nothing real ever dies, and no illusion ever really lived. And so Walt simply does, he gets it for other people, and but then instead of applying it to himself, he doesn't. And it's interesting because even Jesse tried to remind him, like, look, you started this whole mission out because you wanted to make some money for your treatment cost. He has no clue. So Walter has no clue that his self has completely morphed into something totally different than what it started out to be. He went from a high school teacher to someone who wanted to build an empire. And, Jesse tries to point this out to him, and he doesn't see it. But what he does see is he sees that the self isn't a real stable thing for those around him. And instead of applying it to himself, he uses that as a tool to manipulate them. So his wife becomes an object. And he knows at the time, he's like, well, yeah, she hates me now, but that's okay. Some other self will come along and she'll be okay. She'll eventually get over it. And the same thing with Jesse. And in fact, really, Jesse is even a better example because, Jesse was going to kill him and had a gun to his head. And then I think this is when he really got the idea of that first point of the Buddha's lecture, is Jesse went from almost killing him to being, I think, on his birthday. It's his 51st birthday, and I think Jesse was the only one to really get him a present. He got him that nice Tag Heuer watch. And you watch Walter when he gets this watch, and he thinks it's very important. There's a couple scenes where you can tell he really values it. And I don't think he's valuing it because he values Jesse as a friend. I think the watch comes to symbolize his deep insight of the first part of the Buddha's lecture. He absolutely realized that there's no solidity, there's no continuous nature to the self. The self is malleable, it's changeable, but instead of applying that to his own inner world, he uses it as a tool to manipulate those around him. That's why he tries to get Jesse back in the lab. And he knows if he can get Jesse cooking again, he can manipulate him into doing something that really, when you see Jesse wanting to walk away, was a really interesting moment. I mean, he got his $5 million, and he's ready to leave that world. And you can see that transformation of Walter, where he went from a family guy, the guy next door, ordinary person who valued others, to suddenly this pure epitome of ego. He wants to make an empire. I mean, what more ego could you possibly get in a person than wanting to conquer and make an empire? And in my last video, I talked about how the ego can seem like a path of individuation. Like, you find out who you are and you say, well, I need to go on this path. Like, you need to take this personality test, and you find out what your personality is, and then you cling to that. And that's where the ego comes in and feels like it's a you. It's like your real self. But the whole point of the last video is that when that ego comes in, it's like a predetermined set computer program. It's inflexible, and it looks like it's something unique and personal, but it's all predetermined. And so what Walter ends up at least up to season 5, it looks so much to him like he's on this path where he has transformed from an ordinary high school teacher to a conqueror, but he hasn't. All he has done is trade one part of the computer program, one social role, for another, and the role he has changed it for is a far more dangerous one. And but from his perspective, he feels like he's becoming individuated, like he feels like he's becoming his real true self, but he's living out an absolute inflexible computer program. How many humans in history have said they wanted to build an empire and ended up building destruction? So but there's still time. There's still time for Mr. White to see that second point that is so critical, and that's what he misses. And you can really see that, feeling that second point, that the power of the ego is an illusion, that it isn't the CEO who's in charge. That's such an important point. If Walter could see that, he would stop taking the second compensatory prize of, okay, now I can't control what's inward, so I'll control what's external to me. And that's what building an empire is, the absolute control of the external world. And maybe Walt will see that. I don't know. We'll see.